Tihei Mauriora. Kangaru e te whenua, tūtonu te Treaty. Kaharuru ngā rangi, tūtonu te Treaty. Hapai ngā hikitia akina mai rā, te mana te tapu te ihi te wehi o te tiriti o Waitangi. Wairea te whenua e takoto nei, wairea ngā rangi e iri nei, wairea rā ngā ara kau e whakapāhotanga, kia tuia e te treaty ki ngā Ākonga, ki ngā Kaiako, o tira ki te ao Mātauranga o Aotearoa, haumi e hui e taiki. Tū hono mai rā e ngā hau e whā, ki te reo karanga o Ako Aotearoa. Tū hono mai rā, ki te rārangi kauhau e karangatia nei ko Tū Mai Te Tiriti. Hewe anō, tū hono mai rā e te rangatira Te Imaima Annette Sykes, te kākā wahanui mo te rānei. Nau mai, piki mai, haere mai. Ka kite ake i a koe, ka hoki ngā mahara kia Moana Jackson, o tira ki ngā mate e noho mahana tonu nei, ki runga ki a koe, ara ki runga ki a tātou. Ko te ringa mangu, dan mi haka tēnā, ko wā ka wēkau tēnā, ko tō koutou kuia i eke rā o na tau ki te kotahi rau i tērā, o tira ngā mate o ngā hau e whā ko whetūrangitia. Nā reira huatura e ngā mate huhua ki te kuia nei kia pohutukawa. Tātai whetū ki te rangi mautonu, tātai tāngata ki te whenua, ngaronoa. Nā reire te iwi koutou kua hono mai nei tēnei rangi, tēnā rā koutou katoa, nei taku waiata, he wāhanga no te tiriti o Waitangi, no te tīmatanga. Ko wiki tōria te kuini o ingarani e mea atu ana ki ngā rangatira o te wakaminenga o ngā hapu o nutirani me e rā rangatira atu e nei ture ka kōrero tia nei. And I will just chop it off there. As we go forward with this series of 5 seminars, lunchtime seminars, I'll be adding another piece, another verse to the Treaty o Waitangi, a rangi that I've created. I started creating about 30 years ago when Annette, Moana Jackson, Mariana Pittman, and the others joined us at EIT when we started on this the treaty training program, and with the likes of Jane Kelsey and others. Nā reira, e te rangatira, Annette, ka tuku nā te rākau kōrero ki a koe. Te a koe te rangatira.
He tau pai te tau, he tau ora te tau, he tau nehe te tau, he tau no te wahine. Rapua he purapura, he tipu ai te tangata. Tēnā tātou katoa. Kei te tino taitoku i ngā mihi ko mehia e te rangatira teo. Maumahara au i te wā kei te pare wānanga, ko koe tētahi o ngā tino tangata e whai ake nei tuhuarahi me pēhea tātou te iwi Māori i rongi te whakaaro ko tō tātou nei treaty e ngaro ana, e moke ana, e tū ana i rongi te whakaaro e kore moiho te nuinga nā nako o te wairua o ngā whakaaro i roto. Ana kei te mihi atu ki a koe. Kei te tautoko hoki i ngā mihi ko tērā o ngā tō mo tō tātou nei reo Māori te ringa kaha dan mihaka. Koia hoki tētahi o ngā tāngata kei pōneke taua wā ki te aki ki a tātou maumahara ki tō tātou nei reo he taonga tuku iho mai ngā tīpuna. Ana ko tāku nei mihi whakamutunga ki a tātou, i awhi nei i tēnei huihuinga. He tino kaupapa tēnei huihuinga ki a au, nā te mea kei a koutou te whakaaro hohunu e whāngai ana ki ngā tauira Māori, ki ngā tauira Pākehā, ki ngā tangata treaty hoki I tai mai nei I te whaipakaro mō tō tātou nei tiriti. I runga I taua tuahutanga kei te mihi. I've started with a brief recognition in my kōrero today that for me as a treaty activist and this particular topic, it's been almost 50 years that I've struggled. First from a position where Te Tiriti was being sung about by wonderful women leaders like Tuini Ngāwai is something that was almost abandoned, sailing on an ocean to an unknown space, moke, lonely, longing for something to behold. And I come 50 years later to a time this week when we see in the Education and Training Act, Bill number 3, which is now a bill, finally legitimising whare wānanga in equivalent value to universities. Finally recognising that the structural dimension of the articles of Te Tiriti required action. So one of the matters that I'd like us to think at this time of matariki, this time of growth, reflection and action, is that there is a transformation happening in the context of Te Tiriti rights and understanding. That has been as much driven by the activism of the last 50 years, but I also think significant changes that have been promulgated through the hard work of teachers like yourselves. Teachers who have inspired generations of young men and women to go to petitions within their schools from little places like in South Waikato. Those petitions inspire the teaching now of Māori history as part of the colonial history courses in our teaching, right through to the activists of the Ngā Tamatoa period, who spent many hours and weeks pleading to get a petition signed, which was celebrated this year, 50 years since its inception, so that our language could become an official language of this country, and recognising as the first language of this country that it needed to be given the same mana and value as the language of the colonisers that had come in and denied that language to so many. Right through to some of the lawmakers, and I want to pay tribute to the last 3 years for the Education and Training Act individuals, whether they be policymakers, whether they be people who have actually been in our communities taking feedback on that bill, which is now an act, because that is the most, I think, inspiring piece of legislation for us as educators. If we are truly committed to making Te Tiriti the fabric of the society that it is, but recognised as so by all people that have the obligation, responsibility and duty to care for this part of the planet, which Te Tiriti actually requires of all of us. The transformation that is occurring, I hope in my presentation, and I want to show it to you because I know that many of you teach in a range of subjects beyond just Te Tiriti philosophies or kaupapa Māori or tikanga Māori philosophies, to see the context of where Te Tiriti obligation has been given life. So I'm going to use 2 examples in my PowerPoint presentation. One is in the context of co-governance, which has certainly been a divisive debate in our country, and another is in the context of the ownership of water rights and the duties and obligations of that, but also as a subset of the climate change existential crisis that is besetting us at this time, with all of those that have suffered by, as a consequence of Cyclone Gabrielle and the what they tell us are 100-year events in our weather, but actually are much more than that, and are the basis for, I think, some complete disruption as we manage ourselves as communities to meet the challenge of those things. So I've selected a metaphor to head my kōrero, te ohunga ake. It's a metaphor for me that encapsulates notions of an awakening, an uprising, but also a realisation, a movement, an action, a process from passive understanding of a situation to wanting to do something about it. And I've felt that ohunga ake has been my contribution to ensuring that Te Tiriti is recognised as this part of the constitutional fabric of our nation, but in a more practical sense, guide some of the values that will be important for our nation as we mature and grow. So the first slides, if I could ask Christina to assist me, are ones that you might use in your teaching. It might not, because they're not bilingual, these slides. I've deliberately used a set that I've developed with others. But for those that are teaching in Te Tiriti, it's a useful way of conveying simply to either tauira or colleagues, work colleagues who are giving effect to Te Tiriti in the way they teach, the dynamics, but more importantly, the values that each of the articles present and are woven together in a very simple document in English and in Māori, which has withstood the test of time, and together with he whakaputinga o ngā rangatira o New Tirani, are the two constitutional-based documents that lay as a whāriki for our future. The first part of Te Tiriti is the preamble, and we selected whanaungatanga as the value that the preamble is trying to create. And for those of you that are familiar with the Māori version, one of the key words in the first sentence, recognising the new relationship between Queenie Wikitoria and ngā hapu and rangatira of ngā hapu o Aotearoa, is the word atawhai. Atawhai has a particular nuance to it. It can actually just mean shadow in one context, hence the picture, but it can also mean caring for, mindful kindness for, having regard, but in a gentle way, for the new relationship that would be forged by this constitutional arrangement, which purpose was to protect Māori rights and property, to keep peace and order, and to establish spheres of influence. These spheres of influence were particularly, I think, dynamic in the work of the late Dr. Moana Jackson. He always talked about the spheres of kāwanatanga and the spheres of rangatiratanga being allowed to operate separately, but sometimes intersecting where required to ensure the mutual cohesion of living together requirements that were cemented in Te Tiriti. It also has an active, as I've tried to elaborate in the metaphor, obligation of building relationships through shared experience and connections. And for those of us involved in Te Tiriti-based practice, it is I think it's a prerequisite of authentic engagement. So for institutions who are on governance roles with your staff, you must have this as a principle to guide the relationships with your unions, with the protection of the teaching pedagogy that you require from those that are working within your institutions, but also the sense of feeling belonging to that place, to that special opportunity to work the magic of both the partners to establish something unique to this planet. It sets the tone for what follows in the Te Tiriti articles, which are the most that have troubled the courts, but it's really the preamble that sets the framework. Can I go to the next slide, please? Kāwanatanga is the Article 1 article which has troubled Māori and certainly was the basis of much of the protest. But if you're interested in reading about a very, I think, I find it one of the best interpretations of kāwanatanga in itself and of itself, saying nothing different than what was guaranteed in Article 2 in the rangatiratanga section, then I suggest that you read Hugh Fletcher and Shana Elias's son's thesis on this. He's a lawyer in Auckland, but he devoted much time to really researching the context of the kāwanatanga article, how it came to be, and what was in the minds of those arrivals that had been sent here as emissaries of the colonial government in England to bring the news of how we might forge a relationship. I think we should also remember for those of us that are students of history, that in 1835, the Declaration of Independence had been signed in America. There had been a he whakaputanga o ngā hapu, o ngā rangatira o ngā hapu o New Zealand signed, which was our Declaration of Independence. So these constitutional, I think, understandings need to be contextualized against some of those historical moments that weren't just happening here, but were happening globally. The article itself confirms that rangatira agreed to the British having a governor to exercise kawanatanga over British people. And they did so because if you link this to the preamble, one of the key problems was there was a lot of lawless Pākehā arriving, and that's expressly said in the preamble, that we were not used to dealing with in terms of our laws, our customs having to adapt to some of the misbehaviour that was confronting us when they entered our shores. One really needs to understand the power dynamic of that period. There was over 4,000 Māori living in the northern peninsulas. We're told that number's subject to some debate, but there were very few settlers. So it's not unusual that the kawanatanga that was given was a nominal and delegated authority that gave the Queen, or recognised the Queen, Victoria had control of her own people. And I think that's a really nice way of saying that Māori weren't racist right at the beginning. They understood that their laws may not be appropriate for newcomers to their shores, that they were their own understandings and limits on behaviour came from a set of values that may not be identical to here. I think the power granted to the British Crown to govern their people sits beneath the power affirmed for hapu, remembering that Māori didn't have our own system of parliamentary processes at that time. We had a relationship understanding through various tātou pounamu that had cemented in the 1835 document he whakamenanga, and whakamenanga is also mentioned in the preamble. So that's the immediate link between the sister documents, he whakaputanga and Te Tiriti. I think it's also really important that we understand that we were looking at Western-based notions. And so for those Māori that were instrumental in the drafting of this document, they would have been looking through the Bible lens a lot of the time for words like governor and what governorship meant, and looking at ways that they may be constructed. And the individualism of a governor was quite confronting, and a lot of documents and speeches at Waitangi, because Māori was driven more by collective responsibilities, by sense of obligation at place, and to those that whakapapas relationships cemented obligation to. Next slide, please. I should have mentioned that was the first flag of our country, and it was given in 1834 as a recognition of Māori in the top right. And that's a bit of a tension you might see between the protesters, he whakaputanga, and the tino rangatiratanga protesters. They maintain that tension. And so, you know, a compromise has been for many marae that I am to fly both flags now, recognising the importance of cementing both of those haki in the rangatiratanga sphere of our world. Tino rangatiratanga is really simple. It means absolute authority over lands, settlements, and all that was valuable. I say the most important one in the context of today is that you have the most important taonga, the futures of our children, our grandchildren of this country, and you in your tertiary education roles have so much influence for inspiring and actually influencing what kinds of roles they may take. It's a power subordinate to no other, and it's really important that it be recognised. It's really been put simply by the late Dame Mirasazi for me. If you're expressing rangatiratanga, you act like a rangatira, you walk like a rangatira, you talk like a rangatira all of the time. And that's the kind of standard of conduct of leadership that was expected for those of us that were in charge of ensuring the protection or guarding that rangatiratanga in relationships with third parties. The other thing was that it wasn't something static. I think that's why the tino's in front of it. It's a superlative phrase for those of you that are linguists. But, you know, tino rangatiratanga for me also means that it's not fixed, that there is this obligation to see it grow, but also to have it succeeded to because it inspires. And a lot of I've read so many law cases on this, but when you teach, if you can inflect that in your teaching, it would really help. And the other part, I think, from Article 2 that gets forgotten is that it was a gift from our ancestors. So there's an immediate link to the cosmogonical relationships that Māori possessed here and that guide our sense of identity and belonging completely to Papa Tuanuku and Aotearoa. And so, as Moana Jackson says, while it's linked to mana, it's incomprehensible that you would give that away to anybody, as some have suggested in an interpretation of Article 2. It would be legally impossible to give the mana away because you cannot sever the relationships with your ancestors in any conceivable way. The next slide, please. Now, this is the one that is, I think, challenged most of us in modern times in the education sector, and that is the arrangements for the agreements of kāwanatanga to ensure that they will care for all the Māori people of New Zealand and will allow them the same customs as the people of England. And I think that's the question of equality that Māori have felt the process of colonisation deprived them and still deprives them in the modern context. And as part of that equality, there is the secondary issue of equity. So if I can use the nurses' settlement just affected last month, while the pay equality issues between men and women may have been settled between the unions and the Crown, who are ensuring appropriate pay equity arrangements, the pay parity arrangements are still not yet settled, so that Māori providers are in the main earning less than 25% of the capital funds that they have. And so Māori nurses in the main are being paid 25% less than what other nurses are getting in the mainstream, whether they are Māori or Pākehā. Māori then are not being treated equitably, and there's a recognition in that agreement that over the next few years that there will need to be adjustment between the DHBs and the arrangements with the Whatu Ora Ministry of Health that's just been created to address that. So the benefits of royal protection and full citizenship have been tested in a number of contexts. I think the most famous one is the Māori battalion fighting in equal ways with their counterparts and confronting some of the racism even they confronted in the failure to see selection of leadership in particular roles. Ensuring same treatment and ensuring that over time there's access to opportunity and to overcome structural disadvantage. There may actually need to be some particular strategies in place to recognise that historical adjustment or structural adjustment needs to be made in the future. So as long as socioeconomic disparities remain for Māori, we have not fulfilled the obligations of Te Tiriti. So as part of my time today, I want to explore with you some of the strategies that have happened in the context of education. It is well accepted that historical breaches of Te Tiriti by the Crown have led to poor educational achievements. I don't want to bore you with that, but you know, if you do want to go further, there's some really good discussion of this recently in the Wānanga Capital Establishment Report, which is Y718. And I would direct you to Dr. Judith Simon's evidence and summation of her evidence in that report by the tribunal, because it talks about these factors, which I'm sure you're confronting also in the way that you develop your curriculum, you deliver that curriculum, you design or encourage advancement for your tauira, and look at ways that innovation and opportunity is available to meet these. One thing I've seen is Mātauranga Māori is growing in strength, and Dr. Rangi Mātāmua and the way that he's inculcated matariki as a natural part of our celebration of the turns of the seasons is an example of how that Mātauranga Māori, which is sourced in Māori science, but has an equivalence of basis in other science teachings from around the world, can show how transformative teaching opportunity can be. So there's been traditional Māori knowledge and methods of teaching reclaimed. And yet, when I first started in the tribunal, the Y11 case, which was a case about the about our reo Māori facing extinction, there was clear evidence that it was being undermined, threatened with extinction, and unlikely to survive without some urgent help. One thing is career paths have been limited because of our failure to grasp the Te Tiriti obligations I've talked about. One is there has been resistance, apathy, and negativity towards school and education, and that's the poor education statistics that Māori confront. For me in Rotorua and in Te Arawa, one of the things we're really struggling with is the rates of truancy of Māori children from mainstream schools, not those that are at kura kaupapa or the range of other bilingual units, but there are about 70% of Māori students in any 1 year have been either notified as truants or as continued problems of truancy in our region. And as a consequence of those factors, Dr. Simon highlights that educational aspirations have been lowered, and there's been an acceptance of the manual labouring as a natural vocation. But of course, when that disappears, as it did with the state-owned enterprise restructuring of forestry, then there has been an opportunity created for whare wānanga like Aotearoa, like yourselves, all of you, like Te Whare Wānanga o Raukawa, to meet that gap and develop particularly attuned Mātauranga Māori-based curriculum to assist in filling the gaps of people who had thought that they would walk in the footsteps of their parents into those kind of blue-collar places that were shut down, privatised, or made extinct by the process of privatisation. And since the 1950s, there have been huge policy changes in this way, but again, I invite you to look at Ranginui Walker's thesis. You might want to get a hold of Joe Tirito's thesis, I've read that as well, to show how in communities that whole negative statistical and dislocation of Māori and transmigration of Māori from their home communities to urban areas have impacted in this institutional arrangements and the apparatus of the state that was set up to meet the educational obligation. He's very critical, Rangi, of this. He says that the education system wasn't just manipulated by policy, but by the power brokers to maintain an unjust social order between Māori and Pākehā. And I hope that we have overcome some of that structuralism in recent times by bringing a focus to those inequities, those unjust outcomes. What is the rongoa then for intergenerational stolen potential is something that is confronting, I think, many educators at the moment. There is no doubt that this legacy has weighed heavily on the hearts and minds of Māori educators and has been a critical factor in whānau resolving to go down their own pathways of success and growth of their children through Māori-based initiatives, Māori-centred initiatives like kura kaupapa, whare wānanga, whare kura. Hilda Halkiard-Harawira recently gave evidence, there's a Waitangi Tribunal going on at the moment by kura kaupapa because they feel that they're not getting adequate funding from the Ministry of Education. And she said that when she was growing up, and this is what's inspired her to be a tumuaki, to make change, is that when she grew up, she saw a poverty of the spirit of her whānau. For 6 generations, they had lost the language. For every generation, a layer of Mātauranga Māori was not passed on. A level of Māori language proficiency was lost. Māori identity was trampled on. Māori leaders were belittled for being outspoken. I think I'm one of those. Māori children were strapped for speaking their own reo, and you're left with this abysmal feeling that you're not good enough. And it's been a master-servant relationship, and the partnership that we had strived for, the whanaungatanga that the Te Tiriti had promised, was just not cemented in any viable way over those decades. How can we fix that, I think, is one of the challenges that we're looking to educators like yourselves to achieve. At this point, I just want to go to my next slideshow, and I don't want to try and bore you, but there's a lot of vitriol going around that Māori are trying to take over the world in our desire to establish co-governance arrangement over resources. And in that regard, I was one in the 1980s that tried very hard to get co-governance over the Waitangi Polytech in Rotorua, because significant numbers of the students there were Māori. And I was on the Waitangi Polytechnic for several years as a member of the Polytechnic Council. And we had a kind of a go-governance, but not as in equal terms as the kind that many of us are advocating for now. But we did have an inspiring Pākehā leadership in Mr. Murchie at that time, and Elizabeth Murchie, his wife, was the Human Rights Commissioner. And, so this notion of shared governance for me actually was spurred or born from my experience in 1980 as a member of the Waitangi Polytechnic Council, before the Pikiao report, before a number of the education initiatives that have changed the shape of education by the last 40 years. So can I have my next slide, please? Now, I just want to remind, and this is just me, subliminal messages, I tend to do that. Don't forget that it wasn't post-settlement governance entities that the Tiriti was signed with. It was rangatira and hapu. Now, post-settlement governance entities are only recent in their creation. So when you're looking to develop relationships, you must go back in Te Tiriti terms to see who locally are those relationships that you should be developing with. And it's not hard, actually, as long as you reach out. But please don't just do the one-stop shop idea that you can just go to the local trust board or the local renanga and everything is going to be notified to you from them. That's not my experience, and you should know that I doubt that's their expectation, that they are the one-stop shop on every issue. You need to look for the rangatira leadership in education. You need to look for those hapu initiatives that are being promoted around various strategies to assist in, the social institutions of whānau and hapu to provide inspiration for young people to lead into the next generation. If I can go to the next slide. On issues too, when you're developing relationships for co-governance arrangements, whether it's on councils or whether, as in the particular in the water cases, it's about setting up regional bodies that will actually make allocation decisions around water eventually, but more importantly, ensure that there are stewardship arrangements to care for the quality of water. These are the kinds of groups that you should be looking for. Iwi hapu ahika marae hapuri, who can represent themselves. People that are following mana ideas. Mana is a word that has many facets to it. Manu tuku iho, inherited leadership. Mana motuhake, the obligation to be independent, to stand fast and firm. But mana whakahaere is to actually, with authority, imbue the actions that you do with mana. I like that term, mana whakahaere, and I'm saying in the way that you develop relationships, you should be doing that. Can I have the next slide? For me, co-governance is the bottom line to giving effect to and honouring Te Tiriti. In English law, the duty of honour is really important. It's been recognised in Canadian law as something that should facilitate relationships between Indigenous communities and their governments. They have a different constitutional arrangement than us, though they have a particular section that facilitates that. So, you know, when we were protesting Honour Te Tiriti, we were right on the button. I only learned all of this a long time later. But that's something that, you know, this was one of the earliest protest slogans that we used to carry around in the early protest movements in the 70s and the 80s. And co-governance should be about honouring those relationships we've talked about, whatever context it is. But I want to go to the Three Waters context, which is the next slide, to show that this means for us as communities, and because we now have 12 particular areas that have been recreated, there was a big hoo-ha because they only had 4 when they set this up, but they now got 12. We need to be organising and participating in this process. What does that mean for educators? There are going to be a lot of jobs for resource management advocates, for people that are hapu leaders looking at how they are going to give effect to Te Tiriti obligations in managing Te Mana o Te Wai, which is an integral part of the National Policy Statement on Fresh Water. In the context of the crisis of climate change, there is going to be the need for us to organise at local levels, in these catchment levels and at regional levels, amongst ourselves to ensure that if there is managed retreat, if there is going to be community resilience to respond to the crisis of climate change, then we have actually organised ourselves around this. Three Waters co-governance for me is just a natural evolution of Te Tiriti obligation to ensure that the power and authority that was promised to Māori and the obligations for us to care for those that live with us in the Kāwanatanga sphere is actually given effect to ensure we coexist here and survive. Because at the moment, our water quality in a number of areas is seriously in trouble. And we've all seen what's happened in Wairoa, what's happening in Gisborne, what's happening in Northland. I mean, last week, if you couldn't see it, State Highway 35, the slash that came down and prevented people going home from Apoti is absolutely critical for us to plan ahead for. Just last evening, Dame Sian Elias and Sir Terence Arnold were commissioned by MFE to put out a report on this, and they have predicted that this whole notion of climate change adaptation, of managed retreat, of ensuring that there are bespoke processes of Māori are integrally being planned for now as opportunities for us as we go forward. And then we are faced, of course, with the black or the white lash, I say. I was going to say the backlash, but it's a white lash for why we are seeking change to this. Can I go to the next slide, please? And I'm asking for you as teachers to actually say to these people that are worried about sharing of power or adjustment of what has always been, to look carefully at the resource management reforms, which I also think are going to have significant opportunity in the education sector, because there's a lot of devolution likely going on. And I have to say this a bit tongue-in-cheek, because I heard that both the National Party and the ACT Party are determined that if they come in, the Three Waters and the RMA reforms that have just been cemented in legislation will be repealed before Christmas. And I'm saddened by that, because a lot of people have worked on this, myself included, but not for 40 years. You know, the Environmental Defence Society group, Angeline Grensel, Ngā Kaitiaki o Te Ao, people who have worked a long time to work to get our environment issues understood, and on these reforms may have their work prejudiced because people don't want to adjust the status quo. And I think they're burying their heads in the sand a little bit. How does this relate to the treaty? Can I go to the next slide? And I'm not proposing this, but this will be available to the next slide as well. I put together a table to show you in treaty terms what are the sources of rights with respect to water and the environment, how those rights are protected, where those rights holders are, how they've been recognised in the courts, and what they might be. So if we could just go through the next 3 slides quickly, I don't want to spend time on them, but I've got property rights, all these relationships, and I've talked about how in Te Taiao, if you are teaching environmental studies, just to source this document, I wrote it with Matthew Smith, who's a barrister based in Wellington, and we did this as advice to the Federation of Māori Authorities, the New Zealand Māori Council, and unsettled tribal groups. So for me, there is no property in this. What is it? There's a revolution happening in Te Taiao, and we need to actually provide as much material for those people that need to learn from it. So I want to leave those slides, but could you quickly just run through them? They just set some really important principles that I think are going to be quite fundamental in giving effect to Te Tiriti as we move forward. I want to now turn to the Education and Training Act. And for those of you who don't know it, it's one of the biggest rewrite of education legislation in the last century, I think. Certainly, it's a response as significant as the PICO report. So much of its content gives effect to the government's plan to transform the education system following the Kōrero Mātauranga education conversation and the Tomorrow Schools Task Force report. The Education Training Act has the best Te Tiriti o Waitangi clause in the whole country. Don't listen to people that it's in the RMA reforms. Your Section 4 purpose of the Act, so I don't know if there's anyone working for the Kāwanatanga on our screen. Big kisses from me, I love you. It's taken me a long time to get some of the clauses in Section 4. Honour Te Tiriti, not the treaty. Te Tiriti is honour Te Tiriti and support Māori Crown relationships. Beautiful, beautiful, okay? So whoever was responsible for that, I heard the unions had a lot to do with this. We love you as lawyers. We've been arguing this for 30 years. It's never happened before. This is how important your education framework is. So I want to say thank you very much. Do not let anybody repeal this. So whoever you're voting for, make sure there's a bottom line of no repeal, okay? So that's that's an important message I wanted to leave today. There's another important section for you. It's called Section 127 of the Act. Now, these are the things that if you're going into union discussion workers, employers, if you want to look after your workers, these are the provisions that will help you. It sets out the objectives for boards and governing schools. And I think these objectives should actually be filtering right through educational structure. For schools, it talks about at the base primary objectives in governing a school are at D, to ensure the school gives effect to Te Tiriti, including by working to ensure that its plans, policies, and local curriculum reflect local Māori tikanga, Mātauranga Māori, and Te Ao Māori, and taking all reasonable steps to make instruction available in tikanga Māori and Te Reo Māori, and achieving equitable outcomes for Māori students. That has huge implications for curriculum development. So that's another thing. If I was an educator, and it's so hard, it's so few Māori teachers in the kura kaupapa space, which I'm very familiar with, but in the mainstream space, and as someone who's a lecturer in tikanga Māori, there is very little material or teaching aids to facilitate this. So I would be wondering if we could encourage students to start being developmental on these aspects, you know, doing local history boards about how the hapu relates to the akura, doing at tertiary education institutions, how tikanga Māori is shaping the relationships in the context of science development or climate justice issues. I just think this clause Whoever came up with this is really, it's just amazing. And then it sets out some bottom standards against the New Zealand Bill of Rights Act and the Human Rights Act. So it's one of the best, I think, I've ever seen in my time. There are a number of important provisions with respect to total immersion schools in the Act too. Subpart 6 of Part 3 provides for the establishment and operation of kura kaupapa Māori, te aho matua, and te kaitiaki o te aho matua. And subpart 3 of Part 4 provides for the establishment and operation of wānanga. Yesterday, you saw wānanga who made the claim to the Waitangi Tribunal at long last get, and you know, the principle of equality, Article 3, they now have the equal status as universities. Big claps. I don't know who was responsible for that. I was one of the lawyers fighting for it, but I thought it had gone nowhere. And then suddenly out of the blue, just before they come, before an election, this gets announced. I know many of us on the screen that I've seen your names there. Thank you. Not giving up to get that equality of understanding of equivalence. But I also want to talk to New Zealand Institute of Skills and Technology, because the Pūkenga have particular recognition in clause B and D of Schedule 13 to develop meaningful partnerships with Māori employers and communities and to reflect Māori ground partnerships. And I know in Rotorua, well, mainly because I think Willie Jackson's married to my cousin, I don't know, but Wairiki has, you know, we have benefited from some of these skills transfer programs in some of his things, but this should be happening everywhere. And it's about ensuring both that the governance, management and delivery of these partnerships, that you give effect to Te Tiriti or Waitangi. This is in your schedule. I've never seen all of this before. Seriously, it's an act that specifies wherever you are an institution, some of the obligations you must give effect to. Other obligations talk about the definition of school, community, early childhood centres. I mean, as educators, that's a real need. We need to be lifting the quality of those that are teaching our children and making sure that they have equivalence of pay rates as well. And then in terms of development, we should be looking at our boards under the Crown Entities Act, after consultation with the minister, you know, being not these PSGEs or runga, rangatira at place, Māori and Pākehā, tangata treaty and Māori. We need to be making sure we've got the best people for the job, but legislative change alone will not achieve the desired improvements to ensure equitable outcomes for tamariki Māori, for tauira Māori in our institution. We need to do resource development as well as these kind of institutional and structural adjustments. And that's where I think we're failing the most. There isn't enough investment in the resources to create successful outcomes. The ministry needs to support boards and their schools to implement programs. One of the things that Te Aroa is doing that I'm very aware of, they want to try and get more of our children into schools like kura kaupapa, success stories, piki kotuku, you know. They are such wonderful success stories, but they are small schools, and we're trying to transition into those schools, or the other way around, a two-way, a bridge, so that there's transitions of curriculum to mainstream. But there's no resources for that. And the other thing is, people often say they're doing everything, you know, talk up a big game. I've worked with a lot of these ones, but when it comes to actually delivery, they're just holding the putia and not doing it. So we need greater monitoring of those compliance obligations. And the new provisions provide for that, but I haven't seen much of it happening. And I'm speaking solely from a Te Aroa focus, because I don't have time really to do much else. I'd hardly sleep as it is. But I just worry that in the absence, you know, monitoring and evaluation, and especially around statistics, is vital to meeting and planning for the future. Some of the small areas I worry about, you know, places like Taihape, you know, the invisible places like Ruatoria. I don't know how we're going to maintain student numbers, teachers numbers, the profiles of cooperation there, but we've got to do something for these isolated areas, because they do create wonderful leadership in those communities. And I don't think that we have enough investment or monitoring of progress in that. For example, I use taihape because they haven't got a kura kaupapa. They haven't got a kohanga reo. They haven't got those things happening for them. And so we've got to figure out regionally how we can plan to meet the gaps that are there now, but also to inspire for a mutuality of excellence as we move forward. And then the last thing I'd like to emphasize is that incremental strategies of the kind I've talked about must be accompanied by overarching partnership arrangements between tribal authorities, hapu and rangatira who possess mana whakahaere, okay? Don't put it on, I'll never get to a meeting. Do you understand what I'm saying? People who are educational specialists in their region, and I know you all are. My mum was a teacher. They were part of the second wave, I think, of revolutionaries in Te Ao Māori, and they never get a mention. She was a contemporary of Rangi Walker. Her and Merata Mita, they inspired a generation of kauro where I grew up. It's teachers that change the world. And we need to maintain that. You know, I think it's huge respect. And those partnership arrangements, we should be nurturing relationships that give leadership roles for those that possess Mātauranga on these matters. Too often you are receivers of change rather than participants and transformers in that change. We need strong relationships with a range of practitioners. Now, I'm a criminal lawyer, you know, on the truancy thing. You get truant for about 3 years, from 12 to 14. They're in youth court, and then they're with me in the main court. This is really serious. We've got to stop this. And I don't think there's enough effort on truancy. So if you can provide me with a solution, help. I mean, short of me driving around the streets and getting everybody's kids to school, I don't know, because poverty and homelessness is the big issue. It's not lack of commitment. Kids are just hungry. They haven't got the ability. So these are big social issues. I'm not suggesting I'm the panacea for it, but Te Tiriti can provide a framework if we're committed to that. You know that whanaungatanga that I talked about in that first slide? The late Dr. Jackson was always skeptical around my incrementalism. He used to go, Annette, you go in that space, you know, that intersection between Kāwanatanga and Rangatiratanga. But I'm staying out of that space. I think I get squeezed into that space, and I'm a chunky girl, I'm not a skinny one. So, you know, he used to be very quite critical of me trying to stay in that space. He says real transformation could only be achieved by the transfer of power. I have to take my hat off to this act, you know. I don't know who was responsible. I think it emerged under the Labour Party, Green Party alliance, but I'm pretty sure it's been in the making for a while, and educators were in it. Now that kind of transformation and transfer of power, because it's implemented in there, really needs to be boldly asserted as for me, it's an exemplar of excellence of Te Tiriti obligation. And for the future of our children, who are for me, and the social institutions of kura, of whānau for me is the greatest one, we need to ensure that we have whānau oranga assured in the embrace of tikanga Māori and these kind of laws, so that we can protect our future. We can have the pleasure of living in the best part of the world. We can understand that climate change has to be something we meet the challenge with initiatives for, and we need to, I hope, as educators, don't pass the buck. You look in the mirror, you know, ki ngā rangatira. Who are the rangatira for me? Look in the mirror and say, every morning I'm a rangatira. My obligation is to teach. My obligation is to learn. My obligation is to monitor and change. And I think if we have that kind of commitment, there would be no greater way than to see te ohunga ake, which was the metaphor that I started with. That is the uprising, the awakening, the passive to the active. Tūtonu te tiriti, which Joe sang about, you know, which I can't sing. Joe always used to ground, I'm flat, okay? So he's the singer on these things. But, you know, these are what we need to be doing. And I hope this lunchtime lecture has been a help, because I know how hard it is. My mum used to come home so tired all the time. To be an educator in an environment when sometimes the negativity or the social realism of the problems of our society overwhelm us, when many of us are actually inspired to be there by hope of the awakening that might exist for the students we love. So kia ora.
Tarawe katoa kōrero e te ata nei, Annette, ka nui te mihi atu ki a koe I whakapuaki mai nei, I o whakaaro hohonu, whānui hoki mo tēnei kaupapa, whakahirahira rawa atu. I am seeking questions from anyone out there. Thank you everybody for your lovely comments.
This is a provocative question. Kia ora, Helen. I remember meeting with you lots of time, and I wouldn't expect any less than that kind of question. How do we promote co-governance? I think it starts in small communities, and to shift in power, we need to understand that we are actually still connected in local communities where these co-governance arrangements are located. That's really important. But at the national level, they are also really important if we're going to be able to monitor effectively strategies and to have that kind of strategic overview of issues. So there needs to be a recognition that co-governance arrangements can actually mean that you're easily able to see what's going on and then move to develop strategies to make a difference to what problems are. It's the lag that frustrates our people, I think. Why do people be frightened of sharing power? Well, that's an age-old question. You know, men and women have those problems. Governments have those problems. Corporates and relationship starters have those powers, but they should not be, I think, overwhelmed by the need to share power, and to know that when they're giving power, we're giving it to people who will not use it in an unbridled way, that they will be given a particular kaupapa and that will set the limits and obligations and duties of that power. That's why I had that table up to show you that, you know, if you're going to give effect to Te Tiriti, these are the range of rights, these are your obligations, these are where the source of rights are, and the limits and responsibilities of those rights, whatever sector you are actually available to you. One thing is I've learned on these boards is being really clear about what your responsibilities are on the board. You know, you might go on and you're going to be someone who creates a habilitation centre outside the wire. You're not there to stop or to promote the whole changes in the criminal justice system. What you're there to do is to create a good alternative education program for offenders who normally recidivist in nature are trying to make a transformative change. So you've got to also be, I think, critical of yourself and your praxis to achieve what your obligations are in any task.
Okay, that's good, Annette. You can actually see the questions that have come in. You can see the comment from Mihi Rafiti Sarank.
Yes, I've had to adapt my employment contracts because my staff are fatigued too. It's hard in the education sector because I'm a university lecturer too. You don't want everybody on Zoom. It becomes really hard to teach. I don't know, unless someone's given me some ideas, but you know, in my own employment, we've got this 3-2-1, 3 days at home, 2 days when we're all at work, and 1 day when we're all at work together. So that we can actually sit down, plan our strategies and work those things. So that's an employment strategy that I've put in because my lawyers were just worn out. I think we should be recognising those, but I also would like to know, how are we going to stop this post-COVID belief that we can't have interaction anymore in the workplace, that we should all be working from home? And I struggle with that as a kaupapa Māori philosophy, kanohi ki te kanohi. You got to see and breathe and feel them, and anybody if you want to understand them. And I am finding that difficult in a teaching environment, but I'm also very cognizant that there is so much poverty for students that we have to adjust to these platforms if we want to maintain our courses. People, for example, I don't know how people do it in Auckland, $20 for a parking ticket. And also it's $2, you know, outside the university. I mean, hello, you're just not going to go if you're on $120 a week and you're spending $20 a day parking. It's not going to happen. If you're going to take buses, that's fine. But quite often the buses, as my students tell me, their timetables require long days for them. Not the same kind of levels of regularity of the bus routes as they used to be. So there's it's a whole societal shift that's impacting, I think, on well-being. Honour the Treaty Day, well, that's Waitangi Day for me. It's already a public holiday, so that's enough. And the Matariki event, that was a wonderful thing. I like one is, you know, I like Matariki because it's not like New Year's and all of those, no alcohol, all that stuff. All you do is learn traditional kai, and in our firm we had a hautapu. So in your university and your institutions, you could do that yourselves. Because I don't know about the event, but they're just huge. They're becoming enormous. And while it was wonderful to tune in onto TV at 4 o'clock in the morning, I don't know if I can maintain that for more than the last 2 years that I have, to be frank. I love you, Rangi Mātamua, but I don't know if I love you that much forever, okay? But the karakia were, you know, both years. In Tarawa, to see my kawa develop with a woman doing the karakia like that was an enormous transformative change for our iwi. And that could have only been done by someone like Rangi Mātamua, whose name promotes us to dream and float through the galaxies of change and transform, which he obviously has done.
Okay, Annette, I've got a couple of other questions that have come through from the YouTube. I'll just give you the first one. Giving effect to Te Tiriti looks different to everyone. How do we know if what providers are doing is enough or actually giving effect? I'm not sure if you can answer that.
That's the monitoring regimes that you set up in place. So one of the key things that you need to work out is, you know, what's Te Tiriti standard that you want to achieve? Now, I'll give you an example that I'm aware of. Judges in the courts now are all doing te reo Māori, and they have got measurements. So they learn to do a mihi for week 1 and tick, they're doing that well. Then week 2, they learn to do karakia whakapuaki te hui, kapai. Week 3, they will learn how to close the hui. Week 4, they know how to manage cross-examination. So, you know, there's quite clear standards that have been set out to give effect to it. And I'm just using that example. I don't know it, but it's something that I think is going to be more and more important as we monitor and evaluate the curriculum content. But I don't want it to be so straitjacketed that we are all learning Ngāti Porou like I did when I was growing up, tamaho, you know, hello. There, Monty, you're laughing, I'm laughing too, but you know, I'm a Tarawa girl, Ngāti Pikiao through and through, so I want stories from my iwi. I don't want to hear them from Ngāti Porou. So we've got to have curriculum development, and we've got to have, that's the resource development to make this work. It's got to be local. You know, you've got to be adapting. And I don't know how the kura kaupapa and wharekura students have done it on the shoestring for so long. Tuia publishers have been certainly helpful, but, you know, there needs to be more of that happening. And that's why for tertiary education, I think there is a big opportunity for the development of resources from our tauira, or, you know, for me, they're creators that they're coming through.
Very good. Annette, there was a follow-on question from someone saying, and who will monitor when you're talking about monitoring?
Well, that's a big issue, this whole data sovereignty issue that you've raised. So at the moment, there's a mana o rite agreement being negotiated between the iwi leaders group and their technicians, which is led by Kiri Kōwhai with the Department of Statistics. So I agree with you. You've got to treasure that information, but you may at a local level just have, you know, you don't want the police getting all your information about why the whānau, you know, there's just that basic. So you might have a protocol around your statistical development, for example. I'm doing that in some of my initiatives around truancy and trying to stop the parents that come out of jail from reoffending. So you might have data that just measures them, you know. Alcohol-free, 60 days. No internal family violence. Those things I think are really important. How are they giving effect to Te Tiriti? Well, for me, they're inculcating the values of Manaaki that Te Tiriti says, you know, peace and prosperity. Those kinds of things. That's me as a personal level. I'm not suggesting you do that. You have got to uniquely develop the parameters for your institution. But that's when the boards come in, the local boards, to make sure that you're actually doing it, or what you've developed isn't just a template you've got off the internet. It's actually, or AI's developed for you, because that's the other problem. Artificial intelligence is really good at doctoring the numbers to meet the stats, so that there's actually performance standards that are being met.
And I guess there's a question that you might have answered that's come in. How do we ensure that education providers administer the provisions of the Act? Is this person's workplace, they ignore it, they're saying?
Well, then you need to set up a process of monitoring. And if it gets too difficult, then I would suggest you contact your local MOE person. But I think structurally, this is where I said in my speech that I think this needs a lot of work. You know, in Aotearoa, I think there's 1 or 2 personnel from MOE for the whole area. I don't know if that's sufficient. In Tuia and other places, they have them in Hastings or Wanganui. There's nothing around where they are. So, you know, I don't know if that's sufficient. We just got to be a bit more innovative on that monitoring. And then we need to have an open and honest airing of complaints. I mean, it might, if they think that they're actually doing it, then why don't you bring in an external someone to do a review of whether in fact that is the case. But if you're a poor school, like my school is, then normally that review might have to be done for aroha.
There's a question there in the Q&A, Annette, that's a bit of a statement, and you can probably see it there. It's asking about truancy, poverty, homelessness, and whānau being such an important concept. And it's asking, do you think dysfunctional families, whānaus, is the main cause for it? And how can educators fix this huge social issue?
There's a whole colonisation is the cause of it, so I don't think we should look in the mirror and blame it on the families. But families are part of the problem if they've been offered help and then they don't want, you know, and if there's violence in the families, then there needs to be interventions by other whānau members. That's my sense of it. So it's not a causative singular place. But the solution should be multi-layered and multifaceted. So we need to get mothers with 4 children in the motels, into better housing. We need to make sure that they're not changing schools, which is the problem in Rotorua, you know. They're at Malfoy for 3 weeks and they get a new accommodation and then they're over at Western Heights. And they're only doing that because they're moving, because the social housing provider has made them move. So we need to be working collaboratively with Kainga Ora and those people that are creating those. And then transport to school is a huge one. I think we need to, I see in Auckland, they're talking about free buses and a Tory whānau, you know, but we don't have any buses in Rotorua. We just don't have them out to where I live. So there needs to be some innovative thinking. That's why Kohanga and Kura have done so well. I think the vans and the transport to schools have helped them. But that's for kura kaupapa kids. They're quite elite compared to those that are mainstream, because they've actually got that. But a lot of mainstream children, tamariki, don't have that. So I think we need to be actually making sure that there's shared access to resources like that to overcome the barriers like poverty to participation in schools.
Annette, this is not a question that's come from anyone, but I'm just sort of thinking a little bit about tertiary institutions and like boards of governance, and at that level, how do we, you know, is there a trend that's happening across the country in terms of getting even numbers or co-Māori chairs and so on? What do you know of what might be happening or what might happen?
Yeah, there's a genuine shift, not everywhere. Can I say in high population Māori centres like Rotorua, Hamilton, even in the South Island in Invercargill, and it's happening, but it's not happening anywhere. Education is the key. That's why I say Te Tiriti training, that our future's in your hands. The generation of Te Tiriti trainers like Joseph, like Miriana, I did 4,000 treaty training workshops in the 80s in 1 year, just about killed me. But that was what we were trying to do. And what we were doing is a bit like what I did today, just put up slideshows so people have got material to take away and teach for themselves. But yeah, it's a big challenge. I'm sorry, I'm not Jacinda. I can't wave a wand and make it happen. But okay, so but she is hugely, get influencers like her. There are influencers in your community that will make the change to get shared governance. She came down and did a speech. Next minute we got shared governance on a particular forum in water. We need those kind of influencers making the change or encouraging the change. And then we need to vote. I don't know, vote people out that don't do that. I don't know.
Yes, Annette, you talked about treaty training, and of course we of Ako Aotearoa, we provide quite a lot of, provide a suite of treaty workshops that are all online, 3 hours long. There are the introductory ones that are for Māori only. We have introductory for non-Māori, and this is deliberate. We caucus the different groups to prevent sort of crossfire between the two groups. We have these wonderful Pākehā women treaty trainers, mainly Pākehā women and one man and one Māori man. We have treaty in relation to equity, treaty and racism, treaty for managers. So we realised that a lot of the people at the coalface, if you like, at the classroom level, don't necessarily have much sway if the senior managers are blocking things. So we have training for those as well. And so we invite people to check out our treaty professional learning development. That's part of today, is to let people know. We've run about 50 of these already this year, and a lot of them the places have been taken up by people in the private training sector here in Auckland largely. And so we invite people to check these out. Our Māori cultural capability courses online. So part of today's thing, of course, is to promote our own products as Ako Aotearoa, the National Centre of Tertiary Teaching Excellence. So we are a mainstream body, although we're headed by Helen. Like we're a good example. If we say we're treaty-led, our organisation, we have our directors. Helen is Māori, Helen Lomax, and I'm the deputy director. I'm Māori, and we're in a mainstream organisation, Ako Aotearoa. So, we can do it, and this is happening across the country. I'm really pleased with Te Pukenga, that increasingly we see lots of Māori coming into middle management like never before, and I think that bodes really well for the future. So in future an upcoming seminar, we're going to be having Robbie Paul from Waitangi Raro, the Construction Work Development Council, and Ben Ngaia from the Ringahora Hospitality Work Development Council. They're going to be future guests on this show. But we're kind of running out of time, and sorry if I've sort of cut things off. In about 3 minutes, we're going to start closing off, and we'll be putting up a QR code for people who wish to fill in the evaluations. We would love your feedback. We would love your ideas, especially on how can we make learner success for Māori better than it is at the moment. So Annette's talked about things from the treaty perspective broadly and widely and deeply. So I'm looking towards you, the practitioners. Please fill out our survey. It's not very long, and give us all your wonderful ideas, because the gems need to come up through the ranks. It shouldn't be just top down. We're really looking to view ideas. Nā reire te rangatira, e te imaima ko pauhaere te wahanga kia tāua, hoe no kanui taku mihi atu kia koe ko koe I whakawātea nei a koe ki te kōrero mai ki te ao me ki kare rau au I te mōhio koe ngā mea I waho rā e hono mai ana marunga I te YouTube. Engari tērā pia tērā pia ahua ruarau ngā tāngata ko kuhu mai ki runga te Zoom I te rangi nei. Engari kanui taku mihi atu ki a koe mō tō whakawātea I a koe. Tērā pia he kōrero whakamutunga kai a koe.
Ko tauma, kia kaha, koenei te tino kaupapa, kia koutou I pupuri te Māori, me pēhea te whakanekeneke hei tūtuku I kia nei, te whakatinanahi o tō tātou nei treaty. I rungi taua tuahotanga kei te mihi, ka huri au ki te rao ngā reo, kia mōhio ai te katoa. I was nervous coming on today. I don't do these things. I prefer being in the room. And I just kind of kept talking up, trying to avoid the faces. And then I realized you should see me doing that, and that wasn't good. But I do really sincerely hope that you persevere in doing what you're doing and find, you possess imagination in this way, and you are the solutions. I think we got to stop looking for experts to provide the solutions. That's just my last comment. You are the experts. I just want to say that. For me, the people that I encountered in my education changed my life. I came from a very poor whānau, so I've never forgotten the transformers in my life. And they were people that I met in my education journey. So thank you for that. And best wishes to us all. Honour Te Tiriti, transform the world. Constitutional change is on its way. So kia ora.
Ko wiki tōria te kuini o ingarani e mea atu ana ki ngā rangatira o te wakaminenga o ngā hapu o nutirani me e rā rangatira atu. E nei ture ka kōrero tia nei.